scenarios, and we can, if we're not careful, forget that side, as it were, that benefit and appreciation that their example may provide for us and may give us insight for ourselves into being like them, able to do extraordinary things for God. After all, that is the purpose of our lives as Christians. It is to bear witness to Christ, to give glory to God by the way in which we live our lives, which means not just by deeds and actions, but also, of course, our words and the very way, the very manner of our being, the very way in which we live our lives. Now, the book of Proverbs says, of course, famously, there is nothing new under the sun. And often when I advise confirmation candidates in looking for a patron saint to adopt, I usually say to them, of course, you will find, if you look hard enough, you will find a saint whose own life and experience may seem to match or mirror or resonate with your own. Because, of course, that's how human the saints were. They were ordinary human beings like you and I. And, of course, many of them will have lived through very similar experiences to our own. And the difference, of course, yet is that they were able to live through their own time, live through their own difficulties, whatever they were, whether they were social, whether they were environment, whether they were situational, whether they were personal traits, whatever they were able to overcome with courage, with perseverance, with persistence, with steadfastness, with stubbornness, with resilience. And that, of course, is the benefit for us, reader saints, is that we have these people who went before us, who experienced very similar things in life to us, and who yet were able to overcome all sorts of issues in order to glorify God by the living of their lives and by the testimony of their faith. And Holy Mother Church, of course, presents the saints to us in the hope that we will follow in like fashion. And so the saints should be a great source for us of inspiration and encouragement. So the idea of this series then is, as I say, to gain a greater insight and appreciation of the situations and the times and the issues that were prevalent to the saints, so that we can relate to them better and appreciate them more as the ordinary human beings like us that they were, who were yet able to accomplish extraordinary things by collaborating and cooperating with God's grace. Today, of course, happens to be the feast of Saint Bartholomew. He, of course, was one of the 12 apostles. He's perhaps something of an enigma, something perhaps of a mystery, because we don't know as much about him as we do of, say, the others. We don't know as much about St. Bartholomew as we do of, say, St. Peter, or certainly not of St. Paul, let alone perhaps of St. John the Beloved and some of the others too. And yet, there is some evidence it is possible for us to get a better appreciation, perhaps, of St. Bartholomew and of his own particular witness and heroic virtues and accomplishments by perhaps getting a better understanding of the context for him of his life and of his experiences. So that's what we hope to do in this episode. So speaking of context and actually before we talk of context and experiences, just let's clear up a little matter. There are some, of course, contemporary scholars full of the notion of critical theory who posit, contrary to tradition, the notion that Nathaniel, listed amongst the 12 by St. John in his Gospel, is not the same as Bartholomew, who is listed among the 12 by the synoptic gospel authors. And some people, of course, always like to seek and make trouble where there is none. Some people, of course, suggest that this is a great disparity, and but think about it. Other of the apostles also had other names. Peter, for example, was originally Simon Bar Jonah. Saul, of course, became Paul. Some of the apostles had double names, like Judas Iscariot and Judas Thaddeus. So it's quite plausible to think that perhaps Nathaniel was a nickname or a particular name, perhaps that was peculiar to the fellowship of the apostles themselves. When we remember that it is only St. John who refers to Nathaniel, who in the other Gospels would seem to be Bartholomew. But we know that St. John, of course, his Gospel is much more of a personal testimony and witness account than the other synoptic Gospels, which tend to have been collaborative works with other persons involved. With St. John's Gospel, of course, he himself is referred to as the disciple whom Jesus loved, or the beloved disciple. And so his narrative is a little bit more personal. So perhaps that's why he refers to Nathaniel, because Bartholomew was known as Nathaniel within the fellowship of the apostles. Why not? Certainly the majority of tradition seems to back that up and suggest that. And outside of St. John's Gospel, nowhere else is a Nathaniel referred to. But Bartholomew certainly is, and as an apostle. So let's then look at the context for St. Bartholomew. Now, as I said, there's not very much that we know about him. There's not much that we can glean from Scripture, but there is enough for us to be able to contextualize Bartholomew within first century Palestine, and to gain some sort of general appreciation for the experience or for what he must have experienced in his life. So one of the things we'll do, because it'll be good groundwork, as it were, for various other saints that we will cover in this series, let's look at the context of first century Palestine, because both first century BC and AD Palestine was a hive of frenetic, we might say, activity. It was, in many ways, a very unsettled time and period of history for Israel. Some, of course, might say, well, when wasn't there such a time? But, of course, politically, Israel, once again, had been conquered, this time by the Romans. So this next video will give us a little bit of insight into the political context in which, indeed, all the apostles and our Lord himself experienced.
The Great Revolt against the Romans that broke out in Judea in 66 CE can seem like an act of insanity. What were the Judeans thinking? That a handful of freedom fighters could defeat the Roman Empire? The brutal war machine that had conquered the whole world? It seems totally senseless, even bizarre. Let's go back 2,000 years to Judea under the Roman governors. For about 70 years, the Jews enjoyed relative freedom under a ruler from among their own people. Then, one fine morning, the Judeans awoke to a new reality. A harsh Roman governor controlled their land and property. This happened in the year 6 CE, when the Emperor Augustus decided to replace the Jewish government with a direct, tough Roman government that would fill his coffers. Even before the Roman governor reaches his magnificent palace in Caesarea, his officials set out to conduct a census. The officials go from house to house, registering every person and his possessions. No Jew will evade the oppressive tax, not even the poorest farmer. In this burial cave in northern Jerusalem, chilling evidence was discovered of one of the horrific punishments the Romans used to punish those who opposed their rule: crucifixion. The victim's feet were nailed to one wooden beam and his hands tied to another. He was left to suffer on the cross for hours in the hot sun until he died. And so that everyone would get the message, this was done in a central location. This was the main street of Jerusalem about 2,000 years ago. Here, by the roadside, archaeologists discovered a strange, enigmatic stepped stone structure, unlike any found before. People may have been crucified alive right here in the late Second Temple period. The mood in Jerusalem changes irreversibly. Armed Roman soldiers walk the streets, mocking the Jews and their religion. At night, one can hear their wild roars from violent entertainment. But the most humiliating thing is the Roman interference with the temple service. According to the new regime's laws, the Gentile governor now appoints the high priests. Alongside the daily sacrifice to the God of Israel, a daily sacrifice is now offered for the well-being of the Roman emperor, a symbol of oppression and subjugation. The Jews are furious, but from the heights of the nearby Antonia fortress, they're carefully observed. At the smallest sign of defiance, the Roman soldiers will confiscate the high priest's garments, putting an end to the holy temple service. What can be done in these circumstances? The high priests and the wealthy Jews know well what the Romans are capable of doing to rebels. They also believe that the Roman occupation is a divine decree not to be opposed. Here in Caesarea, perhaps even right here, where the ruins of a Byzantine-era synagogue stand, tension reached the boiling point. One Sabbath, several residents of Caesarea offered a pagan sacrifice at the entrance to the synagogue, and all hell broke loose. The provocation was accompanied by beatings and curses, and following the ensuing altercation, the Jews of the city left their homes and possessions behind, took the Torah scrolls, and fled the city. The Romans close in on the Jews from all sides, and with the appointment of new governors, the situation only grows worse. The new governors, even more corrupt and greedy than their predecessors, see their appointment as a chance to get rich quick at the citizens' expense. They stop at nothing to extort the last pennies from the people of Judea. The lives of the Jews under the Roman governors eventually become intolerable, truly hellish. And in such situations, it's hard to react reasonably. The voices of those who can no longer remain silent grow louder. Messiahs and prophets roam Jerusalem, declaring that the end of days has come and that the evil Roman Empire will fall in a great tumult. In the Galilee, a group of freedom fighters forms under Judah the Galilean. They swear they'll never serve mortal masters, only God above. Some of them join radical underground groups, such as the Sicarii. These attack the Romans, but also rob and murder their rich established brethren, whom they suspect to be collaborating with the enemy.
The turbulent time in first century Palestine, both, as I say, BC and AD. Now, what was the religious situation like? Again, so often we hear of and we read in the scriptures references made to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, etc. What's all that about? This next video will give some clarity on that. So again, we can get a better understanding of the context and the experience that the apostles had.
The first group is the Sadducees. This group was wealthy, aristocratic, and somewhat liberal or revisionary. They were also very Hellenized, very influenced by Greek culture and interested in disseminating the values of Greek culture. Most of the priests were Sadducees, and they were politically very powerful during the Roman period. This was a legacy of the 100-year-long Hasmonean kingdom, as we discussed before. When I say that they were somewhat revisionary, I mean that they didn't believe in certain things that a lot of other Jews did believe in. So they did not believe in angels. They did not believe in the doctrine of resurrection. That is, that someday God will raise everyone from the dead, bodily, then to judge them on the basis of their deeds. They didn't believe in predestination, and they didn't go for messianic hopes, belief that God would send a special Messiah to initiate an age of peace and to restore the kingdom to Israel. The Sadducees' focus was on the temple services, specifically the temple sacrifices. This party controlled the temple, and so this was the base of their power and influence in Jewish culture. And when the temple was destroyed, the Sadducees were destroyed. There was nothing for them to do. Their opponents were the more conservative Pharisees. These were very serious, very pious Jews. They paid attention to oral tradition. They had a doctrine of oral tradition, that Moses had received not only the written law, but also an oral law that had been passed down through a chain of teachers, including them. They did have messianic hopes, and they did believe in resurrection. It seems that most of the scribes were Pharisees, the scholars who copied and learned about the law. They were intensely law-focused. They were interested in interpreting and applying the law. And they always took a conservative approach. They did what they called building a fence around the law. This is coming up with a system of rules that keep you from even getting close to breaking the law. For instance, the law of Moses forbids harvesting on the Sabbath. The Pharisees forbid walking through a field on the Sabbath. Why? Because your sandal might catch on to a plant, and you might thereby accidentally harvest a little bit of grain. Their critics would say they erred on the side of strictness, but they didn't see it that way. By the time of the Roman occupation, the teachers among the Pharisees were being called rabbis, and the word rabbi just means teacher. Prior to this, there had been no such special class of people in Judaism. And the rabbis belonged to various schools of interpretation, following various influential figures. So, for instance, two of the influential schools during the Roman era were Hillel and Shammai. And by the way, we should mention that a lot of what we know about the Sadducees and Pharisees comes from the New Testament, that is, comes from the Christian part of the Bible that was written in the 1st century Common Era. A third ancient group are the Herodians. These were a party that supported the Roman government of Palestine. They get little mention in the New Testament, and very little is known about them. Fourth group are the Essenes. These Jews lived in a monastic commune, separated from the rest of society. They practiced nonviolence, and what they mainly did was await the end of the age. They were intensely messianic. They expected that things would soon be set aright by God through this special agent. From the Essenes, only in the 20th century, we discovered what is called the Dead Sea Scrolls in a place called Qumran. This is a collection of writings that was stored or hidden away by Essenes. The Essenes believed they were the only remaining true Israelites. The Essenes believed that the Pharisees and Sadducees were corrupt, that they had compromised with wider society and not been faithful to God. The last group are the Zealots. You could say they're as much a nationalistic group as they are a religious group. Their aim was to overthrow the Romans, so as to bring about an independent Jewish state. They engaged in what we now call terrorism against both the Romans and against collaborating Jews, leading up to the war that ended in 70 CE. When they were defeated by the Romans and the temple was destroyed. The Zealots basically came to an end with the mass suicide at Masada in the year 73. When the Romans were closing in on them, they killed themselves, some 956 of them. And that seems to have been the end of the Zealots.
The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip. And said to him,
"Come with me."
Philip was from Bethsaida, the town where Andrew and Peter lived. Philip found Nathanael.
We have found the one whom Moses wrote about in the book of the law, and whom the prophets also wrote about. He is Jesus, son of Joseph, from Nazareth.
Can anything good come from Nazareth?
Come and see.
When Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him, he said about him, "Here is a real Israelite."
There is nothing false in him.
How do you know me?
I saw you when you were under the fig tree before Philip called you.
Teacher, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel.
Do you believe just because I told you I saw you when you were under the fig tree? You will see much greater things than this. I am telling you the truth. You will see heaven open, and God's angels going up and coming down on the Son of Man.
Okay, so out of the political and the religious turmoil and turbulence of the time comes this figure of Jesus, comes this man who is the very embodiment of peace and calm and of charity. And people like Philip and Andrew and Bartholomew stroke Nathaniel, they were seekers after truth. So as I said to introduce that clip, but I don't think everyone heard it, Andrew, of course, had been a disciple of St. John the Baptist. St. John the Baptist had pointed out Jesus to Andrew. Jesus invited Andrew to follow him, come and see, and then Andrew, of course, went and got Simon, who became later Peter, his brother, brought him to the Lord. Philip brings, of course, Bartholomew stroke Nathaniel. But these were people. You can, I suppose, if you think of our present situation, I mean, would we not? What would we not give for our Lord to be with us now, to return among us now in this seeming chaos, this topsy-turvy world which we are living in and experiencing at the moment? In many ways, first century Palestine was a lot like now, in terms of this kind of frenetic energy, this kind of sense of threatening sense of foreboding, I suppose, that some of us particularly are perceiving and feeling in this present time. But through that, almost as it were, kind of cutting through that, appears Jesus. And so there's already, I hope, you can appreciate a that we can learn about the context of first century Palestine, the context for the apostles, what the reality of things of life was for them politically and religiously, but also too the impact that Jesus made upon them. I mean, of course, obviously, such that they gave up whatever they were doing and followed him. Now, of course, it is Nathaniel, stroke Bartholomew, who initially says, "Can anything good come from Galilee?" And Bartholomew himself actually came from Cana. And the site which traditionally is believed to have been the village of Cana was about 7 miles north of Nazareth. And in this next clip, we're going to see that hilltop village, that place where, of course, the first miracle that Jesus performed occurred. So here, let's learn a little bit about Cana.
A few years ago, Dr. Thomas McCullough and his team conducted an archaeological dig in this area. And at the end of their first excavation season, they accidentally discovered a mysterious cave. In this cave, they found multiple important artifacts buried inside, such as a Greek graffiti that reads Kyrie Jesu. Translated, it means Lord Jesus. They also found a prayer altar with Maltese crosses carved on it. But more significantly, they found broken remains of 2 stone jars with spaces for 4 more. These artifacts date as far back as the 5th century, which means that even though they don't go as far back as the time of Jesus, they still suggest that this location was chosen by the Byzantine believers in the 5th century to serve as the commemorative spot where Jesus turned water into wine.
Climbing to the top of the hill, we realize how big this town must have been, as we keep finding pottery, water cisterns, and many ruins that have been laying here untouched for centuries.
Ooh, wow!
It has circles on it!
I can see the circles and the drawings on the pottery. We have never found anything this size on any of the sites. This place is just a treasure chest of archaeology.
It looks like a mikveh.
Like a ceremonial bath. Look, you got stairs and it's plastered, and you got stairs up.
During Byzantine period, once it became a Christian place, this could have been a baptismal place. Yeah.
But wait, if it's a mikveh, then the synagogue has to be here.
Yeah, maybe this was a synagogue.
So I think, at least, it looks like one.
Besides the abundance of archaeological evidence on site, this location has also a strong historical link for being the true Cana, as the early maps consistently locate Cana to be north of Sepphoris. And it wasn't until the mid-17th century that this designation was changed, and the modern town of Cana was chosen instead because of its easy access. But the pilgrims of old came here, to this ground. So could it be that this is the biblical Cana? The one mentioned in the Bible? The one where the wedding was held? If so, this would explain why centuries later the Byzantine believers made the veneration cave to commemorate the first recorded miracle of Jesus.
Okay. Okay. No. I hope that that has sorted out the sound. If somebody would be kind enough to let me know, I would appreciate it. If somebody could just say in the comments that now they have sound, that they can hear me speaking. As soon as you like. So, anyway, so there we were. So there was more information there about Cana, and I'm just going to show. Oh, thank you. Somebody's commenting. It's okay. Good. So this this next video is the final video from Cana, and really this is just for you to appreciate the view and the location of ancient Cana.
Even though we didn't get to see the inside of the pilgrim's cave due to the overgrowth and the collapsed rocks, we still got to see this place, a place which is the best candidate for the biblical Cana, and we got to see it in its untouched form, so that we can now mentally picture what it would have looked like as we read the account of the miracle. Jesus would have been down there, right?
Yeah. Wow. Can you believe the view they had here? It is so beautiful. Like, just imagine a wedding here, and you got 6 stone jars filled with water, and you just turn them into wine.
And Nazareth is right there. The Mount of Jonah is right there. Like all these places that we pass by.
Wow.
And the valley is just gorgeous.
Incredible.
So there, isn't it just beautiful? An absolutely amazing location and setting. And as you heard said there, of course, you can see Nazareth 7 miles in the distance due south from the ancient site of Cana. So, of course, we were looking at Cana because that's where Bartholomew / Nathaniel hailed from. So, again, I hope that has given you an appreciation, again, of what he must have experienced in his life. You know, if that was indeed Cana, and it was the Cana that he came from, then those hills and that valley, these things would have been very dear to Bartholomew's heart. Now, again, to give us more context, let's look at life, what life was like. Now, the amazing thing is Nazareth, which, as I said, is just 7 miles due south from ancient Cana. in Nazareth, they have a first century farm, which today has been, set up for visitors and tourists, but from which you can get a real feel for what life in first century Palestine, everyday life, was like. So I'll play you this next video so that you can get the benefit of that.
Over 2,000 years ago, Nathanael asked, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" And the apostle Philip answered, "Come and see." We welcome you to come and discover the first century life on the authentic sites. The first century Nazareth village is a living history village located in the heart of old Nazareth, Israel. Experience Jesus' stories in a fresh, dynamic way. Walk where Jesus walked.
There we go. So although for some reason they've given it a kind of almost sepia-like bloom over the film there, this next clip I'll show you again from the village gives you a more perhaps real appreciation of the village and the context. So here we go with that. So as you say, here we are without the kind of sepia and bloom effect on the film. And although, of course, these are technically actors, nonetheless, they are gainfully engaged and employed in realistically representing life as it was in first century Palestine. So here is someone using tools for carpentry that no doubt St. Joseph used in his workshop and that our Lord witnessed. And of course, what's also beautiful is the fact that this is in Nazareth, and that this land that we're seeing, this village, was excavated and is actual archaeologically evidenced as being from the first century. And amazingly too, that the olive trees that you see there date from the first century as well. And they've worked on those, etc., so that and again with the farming, with the plough there, they actually do plant wheat seeds and they reap harvest, and using the tools of that time, they press the olives for the oil, and they thresh the wheat, etc. And also too, you can, if you go to Nazareth and you go to see the first century village, you can also book a meal which they cook obviously on site, and where you can experience eating unleavened bread, as we can see, being cooked there. So if you ever have the opportunity to go to the Holy Land and go to Nazareth, then, you know, I strongly recommend going to Nazareth village and seeing for yourself and getting a feel for an experience of what life must have been like for the apostles and Jesus back in first century Palestine. This next clip, again, forgive me if this appears a bit indulgent, but I just find it fascinating and really interesting. Here is another video from the Nazareth village, and this is of the olive harvest. There we go. Isn't that fascinating? So I just those clips themselves actually have been able to give you an appreciation and an insight into how first century, what life was like, ordinary everyday life, what it must have been like in first century Palestine. One of the interesting things actually is the sheep. You'll recall, of course, that our Lord talks about the sheep knowing, recognizing the master's voice, the shepherd's voice. And in the village, they have a flock of sheep. And of course, they use first century techniques. And so the sheep are taught from lambs to recognize the shepherd's voice. And when you visit and tour the village, the shepherd gives a demonstration so that you can hear him calling, and you see the sheep and the lambs run to him, recognizing the shepherd's voice. It's incredible, quite incredible. Worthwhile going to see that if you can. Appreciate times are difficult at the moment, of course. Anyway, so as I say, although there's not much detail, as it were, that we have concerning St. Bartholomew's life, certainly not as much as we have in comparison to some of the other apostles, nonetheless, all of what we've seen in these video clips, read the political situation, read the religious situation, read the everyday life circumstances, all of that we should be able to glean from that an appreciation of what life was like for Bartholomew and for the other apostles, and particularly, of course, that beautiful landscape and country of Cana, from whence Bartholomew came. Now, this next video gives us the whole story, such as we have of St. Bartholomew. So I'm going to use that as an introduction, as it were, into the next stage, where we'll look at the legacy of this apostle.
Jesus had 12 disciples, and in this series we're looking at what happened to them after the biblical narrative ends. Since scriptures don't tell us, we've got to look into traditions and external sources. Today is the turn of Bartholomew, whose travels had only just begun after he'd met Jesus. We first meet Bartholomew when Jesus groups all the disciples together for the first time and sends them out to preach his message. He's often bundled together with the apostle Philip, who would gain later fame from his story about the Ethiopian in the book of Acts. Bartholomew is notably absent from the Gospel of John, and is seemingly replaced by someone called Nathaniel. Now, of course, over the years it's been thought that both Bartholomew and Nathaniel were the same guy with two different names, which, if you've seen any of the previous episodes on this channel about this, isn't exactly a surprise. Saul becomes Paul and all that sort of thing. Nathaniel only ever appears in John's Gospel, and again is bundled with Philip. In his brief appearance, Philip takes him to meet Jesus, and Nathaniel scoffs when he hears where Jesus comes from. But when he meets him, Jesus really impresses him, and he decides to stick around. He's not mentioned much after this, but he's present at a couple of the same miracles that Bartholomew's recorded at being at, and this is another reason why people put two and two together. Some modern scholars aren't quite as sure that it's the same chap. So what were these miracles that Bartholomew was present at then? Well, he was there to see Jesus ascend alongside the other remaining apostles, and after being part of the group that picked Judas's replacement, he was also there to see how Pentecost went down, and was obviously there for Peter's grand speech. After that, we don't hear from him again, but that's not to say that he wasn't up to anything. Old Bartholomew had got wandering feet just like his friends Paul and Peter, and he set off on a missionary trip just like his peers. However, while one trip is documented, the other is only told in traditions. First off, the documented evidence is from our compiler of all documents Christian, who we met in the last episode, Eusebius. In part of his writing on history, he notes that Pantaenus, a noted scholar of the city of Alexandria, had decided to set off to preach the gospel message. He set off for a long journey to a place he was sure hadn't been reached yet, India. Once he arrived, though, he began to preach and realised that people there had already heard the gospel message, and some of them had even become Christians. Turns out that years prior, Bartholomew had beaten him to it, and had even given them a parting gift, a copy of the Gospel of Matthew, written in Hebrew. On to the tales told by traditions then, and once again Bartholomew was off to preach to anyone that would hear him. However, this time he would take his fellow apostle Jude with him, and they would both end up in Armenia. Both are seen by local tradition as being the ones that brought the message of Christianity to the area. And it's here that poor Bartholomew became a martyr. The apostle had been preaching the gospel and caught the ear of the king, who converted from the worship of the local pantheon to Christianity. Now, not exactly everybody was happy about this, particularly the king's brother. Thinking that this would cause grief with the Romans, he ordered a grisly fate for the apostle, to be skinned alive and then beheaded for good measure. Scholars, of course, aren't entirely sure of the accuracy of this tale, since the name of the king or his brother in the tales don't line up with any historical records, but legends often have truth in them, so some suggest that this may have actually happened just in India instead. In any case, as with the case with Peter, his martyrdom is his symbol, usually a depiction of him without any skin or a set of flaying knives. Naturally, he's the patron saint of Armenia. Well, turns out that it's not just the famous apostles who really wanted to fill the Great Commission to preach the message to the ends of the earth.
Okay, so that gives us a nice overview to the rest of what we know, of what we think we know about St. Bartholomew. Now, just for interest, I forgot to put this up earlier, so here is a map of Israel, and in the center there, the is Cana. So as you're looking at the screen, to the left is the Mediterranean Sea, and the blue water on the right-hand side, that is the Sea of Galilee. And sort of in the middle between the two, hopefully, you can see written Cana of Galilee. There's a white cross with a red background. Now this, of course, is a map of India, and the red spot that you can see, again, more toward the left-hand side, is Kalya, where it is believed Bartholomew took the gospel. Now, of course, that must have been quite a trip. Travel in first century Palestine was, well, in the first century anywhere, was not easy. And this next clip gives us a beautiful insight into the nature of travel at that time. Now, this particular video is referencing more Paul's missionary journeys. However, of course, Bartholomew, as we learned in the other video, took the gospel after India to Armenia and in Asia Minor. So, in fact, he went through very similar terrain to St. Paul. So here's somebody telling us, explaining to us what travel was like back then.
Traveling west from Tarsus, Paul and Silas would have been confronted with the Taurus Mountains, which separated the coastal plains around Tarsus from the interior regions of Cilicia, Galatia, and Asia Minor. They would have had to travel through a treacherous pass known as the Cilician Gates. The Cilician Gates are a series of narrow gorges cut through the Taurus Mountains. The peaks of these mountains can exceed 12,000 feet and have been a harrowing challenge for travel, trade, and military excursions for centuries. The Hittites, the Mongols, the Greeks, the Romans, the Crusaders, all these great armies had to make their way through these tight passes that separated east from west. Today, the Gülek Pass has been conquered by a modern highway. This modern highway here in Turkey that runs from Tarsus to Ankara. Now, Paul and Silas would have taken a narrow, treacherous path through this great mountain barrier, but since this is only a half-hour show and I may or may not be more spoiled than they were, I'm going to take the 70 miles to Derbe and Lystra on 6 lanes of divided highway. As we've learned in prior episodes, the Romans built a vast network of stone highways around its empire. They were durable, flood-resistant, often guarded, and wide enough for soldiers to march 6 abreast. It's been said that if all the roads from Rome were linked end to end, they would circle the earth twice. These are the roads that Paul and his companions often traveled, and the roads that provided relative security. However, just off the Roman highway system was another world altogether. More often than not, Paul and his team would have to travel these secondary roads where safety or even survival was uncertain. Flash floods, wild animals, marauding bandits were all known perils of traveling these ancient roads. And as for me, I'm just happy to work the word marauding into this show. Back in the 1st century, in the eastern Mediterranean, these back roads were only passable during the summer months, when the streams were dry and low. During the late winter or early spring, travelers had to navigate raging rivers and sometimes makeshift bridges, so drowning was a real hazard. Worse than rivers, though, were the robbers and thieves, since people tended to travel with pretty much everything they own, including silver coins. Travelers made prime targets. Perhaps the scariest peril of all was the wild animals. I mean, at least a robber might leave you alive, right? Apuleius, a philosopher and poet living a few decades after Paul, wrote about the wild boars, bears, and wolves that roamed present-day Turkey and Greece, and how travelers often journeyed in fear, especially through forest areas. Apuleius wrote this: "We were told that the road we wished to take was strewn with half-eaten corpses and clean-picked skeletons, and that we ought to proceed with all possible caution and in a compact body with no stragglers. The higher the sun, the milder the wolves." In one of his letters, Paul wrote this: "On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure." 2 Corinthians 11, 26 and 27.
Well, there you go. So travel was quite precarious in those days. And here, so in the middle of that map, you can see Armenia. You can see just towards the lower left-hand side, Syria and Lebanon. Underneath Lebanon, of course, is Israel. Going directly above Lebanon and Syria, there you have Turkey. And so Bartholomew, and according to legend, accompanied by Judas Thaddeus, they walked, probably, certainly the more mountainous aspects of that journey, across all of that to Armenia. And it is in Armenia where I suppose the greatest legacy of Bartholomew is to be found. And this next video clip gives us something of a history, almost the whole history of Armenia. But I'm conscious of the fact that probably most of us are not familiar with Armenia at all. As it happens, a friend of mine has just moved there to teach in an international school, which is rather coincidental. But anyway, here, and I do hope to be able to go out there and visit him and see Armenia for myself. But here in this next video is a kind of the history of Armenia in 5 minutes. But from it, we can see the legacy of St. Bartholomew.
Mr. This is Western Asia, and here is Armenia. Now come on, let's see what's been happening there, shall we? People have lived in Armenia for a long, long time, the first settlements arising in the Neolithic era. As for the Armenian people, their ancestors no doubt descended from the ancient inhabitants of the region, such as the Hittites, Mitanni, and Urartu. The ancient Armenian historian, Movses Khorenatsi, names the heroic figure Haik as the founder of Armenia, said to be the son of Japheth, the son of Noah. And you see this city? This is the capital of Armenia, Yerevan. And that mountain over there? That's Mount Ararat, the area the Bible states as the landing place of Noah's Ark after the Great Flood. Interestingly, the first thing Noah did after the flood was plant a vineyard, and funnily enough, the oldest wine press in the world was discovered in Armenia. Anyway, the great Iron Age kingdom of Urartu weakened with wars against the Assyrians, and by about 585 BC, the Medes from Iran took over Armenian lands. Persian rule followed, who made Armenia one of their satrapies. Under Persian rule, the Armenians joined the Zoroastrian religion, and no, that did not involve worshipping the Spanish vigilante. Alexander beat the Persians, and Armenia later became subject to the Greek Seleucid Empire, but retained a lot of freedom. When the Seleucids were beaten by Rome, the Armenians fought for their freedom, which Rome allowed, and Artaxerxes I founded a dynasty that would reign for 2 centuries. The kingdom of Armenia reached the pinnacle of its power under Tigran the Great, who took Syria and conquered Phoenicia and big bits of Persia and Anatolia, so Armenia ended up enormous under his rule. Also very rich and splendid. But then he got tangled up in war with Rome. Tigran was finally defeated by Pompey the Great, but was allowed to keep ruling, just not over the lands he'd conquered. Why? Rome wanted them. Over the next few centuries, Armenia was often a battleground for the forces of Rome and Persia, and sometime in the 1st century, tradition tells us, Thaddeus and Bartholomew, 2 of Christ's disciples, brought Christianity to Armenia. In the year 301, Armenia officially adopted the Christian faith as the state religion, the first country ever to do so. This beautiful building here is Etchmiadzin, the oldest cathedral in the world. Amid the chaotic times of constant invasion and foreign occupation, Armenian national identity was solidified by the scholar Mesrop Mashtots, who invented the Armenian alphabet and ushered in a golden age of Armenian literature. In the late 4th century, Armenia was divided between Byzantine and Persian rule. Armenians did better with Byzantium, many becoming generals and even emperors, but the invading Arabs eventually snatched the land for themselves. In the 880s, Armenia under Ashtot I kicked the Arabs out and restored the Armenian kingdom, which had its best and grandest days under Ashtot III, but ended up conquered by Byzantium in 1045. Then the Seljuk Turks appeared and took over. Many Armenians fled to other lands. Centuries passed, the Mongols invaded, and Armenia was later viciously fought over by the Turks and Persians. But whoever won what battle, the Armenian people suffered either way. Even when agreeing on their borders in treaties, clashes continued and new treaties were made, and clashes continued, and so on for centuries more. But the Armenian church kept the people together and gave them hope. Then, in 1804, Russia marched south and began crushing Persian forces and gobbling up their territories, including, in 1828, eastern Armenia. Russian rule welcomed Armenians back to their homeland. Meanwhile, many Armenians in the Ottoman Empire to the west, despite discrimination, were organizing nationalist movements and also thriving and amassing considerable wealth, much to the anger of the Turkish majority. Sultan Abdul Hamid II did not want these Christian Armenians doing well while his own empire decayed, and officially approved massacres of Armenians by the Kurds and other tribes. Armenians fought back and were met by the Hamidian massacres, where thousands of Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks were butchered across the empire. Up to 300,000 were killed. But this was chicken feed compared to what followed. The Sultan himself was overthrown, and the Young Turks took over, wanting to reform and westernize the crumbling Turkish world. But any hopes of the minorities were soon dashed to pieces, and things only got worse. When Turkish Minister of War Enver Pasha's attack on Russian forces in 1914 totally failed, he blamed the defeat on the Armenians, who were literally accused of colluding with Russia. Jihad was proclaimed against Christians, and the Turks initiated the infamous Armenian genocide, involving mass killings and executions and starvation and deportations and death marches into the Syrian desert for women, children, the sick, and the elderly. All told, some 1.5 million Armenians were massacred, and the lives of the survivors ruined forever. Back east, in 1918, Armenia finally formed its own country, and it lasted for 2 years, as Russia swallowed it up again. Russia had turned communist after its revolution, and life was hard and repressive, especially under Stalin. And if you dared even whisper something slightly pro-Armenian, you would be bundled off to Siberia. Then there was a hideous earthquake. Independence finally came in 1991. Armenia won a war against Azerbaijan, and stepped onward despite corrupt politicians to make their nation a better place. And I think they've done a pretty good job. Let's hope Armenia's future is brighter. Their people have suffered horribly, but still given so much in science, art, music, sport. They're also really good at chess. What do you think lies ahead for Armenia? Comment below, but for now, bye-bye!
Well, how much of that did you get? But fascinating stuff. And of course, what's interesting is that all the way through that, the Christian faith and presence has retained in Armenia to this day. Indeed, Christianity in Armenia is healthy and strong and young. And of course, what's very interesting is that point that in 301 AD, Armenia was the first state to have Christianity as its main religion, predating, of course, the Edict of Milan and Constantine for the Roman Empire, which didn't occur till about 311, 314 AD. So great claim to fame there. Interestingly as well, there is also a tradition of the lance, the spear, that pierced our Lord's side, having been taken to Armenia, and indeed on the feast day of Saints Bartholomew and Thaddeus, the relic of the spear is taken out for veneration there at the main cathedral in Yerevan. So that is the legacy of St. Bartholomew's witness, that the church in Armenia, Christianity in Armenia has, despite that incredible history, despite that in many ways awful history, and particularly at the beginning of the 20th century with the Armenian genocide, nonetheless, the church survived, and Christians are still there to this day. So that's an incredible legacy, really. See, even though we don't know, as it were, a great deal about St. Bartholomew, nonetheless, the evidence, such as there is quite strong for the simple fact that this tradition of his taking the gospel both to India and to Armenia has survived all these thousands of years. And that alone should give us hope and inspiration ourselves. After all, many of us, would say, who are we? Who are we? Well, in many ways, most of us today have much more advantage than ever the apostles did in their day. If you think of our quality of life, if you think of our ability to travel, if you think of technology and communications and everything else, all these things that are readily available to us today, none of which was possible in Bartholomew's day. And yet there is a legacy of St. Bartholomew's witness still to this day, 2,000 years later. Now, if he could achieve that, what could we achieve? That's the question, of course, and that is the challenging thing about studying the lives of the saints, is that they challenge us regarding our own particular witness. Now, just referring again to the genocide, and because today, of course, is St. Bartholomew's Day for us in the West, this next clip is of a monastery that was built on what was traditionally considered to be the site of St. Bartholomew's martyrdom. Now, re his martyrdom. Now, if you're of a sensitive disposition, you might want to look away. Here are some artistic depictions of St. Bartholomew, and of course, as was referred to in that video, the iconography connected with St. Bartholomew is of his being flayed. According to tradition, he was skinned alive whilst being tied to a cross. Some tradition says that the cross was upside down after the fashion of St. Peter, and that he didn't pass away until he was decapitated. Now, in other depictions, sometimes he is even shown sort of skinned, but upright, but over his arm, draped over his arm like an old anorak, the skin from his body. He's often depicted like that, particularly in statues. So anyway, so this next clip, on our final clip for this show, shows the supposed place, according to tradition, where St. Bartholomew received his martyrdom. It also, of course, in this clip, you will see the devastation after the pogroms by the Turks in the early 20th century.
Jesus.
There we are. So it was very quick there at the beginning of that clip, but it showed you the monastery and the church at the beginning of the 20th century, and that, of course, subsequent after the genocide of the Armenians by the Turks, the destruction of that monastery and church. But as I said, the faith is very much alive still in Armenia, and I hope very soon to be able to visit there and experience it for myself. That brings us to the end of this episode. Apologies for the slight technical glitches. I think I've worked out what went wrong, so we'll try and avoid those going forward. And I hope that perhaps you might feel that you have a better understanding and appreciation of St. Bartholomew. As I say, although we don't have an awful lot of information, nonetheless, we can glean an idea and an appreciation for what he, both what he experienced in life, what he saw, where he lived, where he was brought up, what he must have experienced with Jesus, and subsequently his travels and his missionary endeavors. And as I say, to leave that wonderful legacy of a church still 2,000 years later, worshipping and witnessing in Armenia. So bless you for watching. Our next show will be on Wednesday, which will be late night catechism. And of course, mercifully, thank you to Father Thomas in Chicago, who is still broadcasting daily mass for us. So if we don't see you at mass, we'll see you hopefully on Wednesday. Meanwhile, take care, God bless, and thank you for watching.